My paper, my starting point is the first term of the EUI when I was working on a book called Can Government Go Bankrupt? So I'm going to cheer you up by looking at the great crisis of the mid-70s when economies contracted, when there was a necessity to accept things. Steinrocken said votes count, but resources decide. What did people learn from the 1975 recession? Inflation was a cure that created a new problem. And I think what we heard this morning will create new problems. Public expenditure threatened take-home pay. People learned, and the result was model tourism and Thatcherism in the 1980s. So that people do learn, things do change. What we think is unacceptable or inconceivable is a very static thing. Secondly, I would dismiss what may be being talked in the other seminar on the basis of past research. When you have a revolution of falling expectations, if people project it, then if things hit bottom and stabilize, then there is reprieve. So the idea of an ever-growing economy is being replaced by an ever-shrinking economy. Stopping shrinking is relative progress. Secondly, within every country, populations have differential capacities for coping and vulnerability. The categories are constant, the distributions will vary between countries, and the means will vary. But the employed are more at threat of losing their job, but they're only half the population. Credit cards, people who are overextended are in a minority. Those who have mortgages are in a minority, least of all in Eastern Europe, where housing was redistributed without liars' loans. They hadn't yet got really capitalist. Educated people, pensioners have been relatively protected. Their pension has been protected by a fall in inflation rates, and they're not losing their pensions even if it's being squeezed. The theory that rising unemployment will cause general pervasive crisis assumes a ripple effect that's very strong and reaches very far out against no obstacles. There's a big difference between how European citizens evaluate micro and macro features of government. Consistently for many years, citizens have seen that governments have got big economic problems. But that doesn't mean that they think their own household situation is bad. In fact, 3/5 in spring 2012, when governments were doing badly, said their household was all right. So when we generalize about popular responses, we've got to bear in mind that we can't infer them from macroeconomic statistics or from the problems that legitimately concern people who are managing either the Greek economy, whether they're in Athens or in Brussels. Now, the next point I would like to make is that EU elites must cope. It follows from a macroeconomic crisis. I would say the response can fairly be described as technocratic in the classic sense, because there is integration by stealth through small matters. There is a strong technocratic point of view as a stream in European society where you judge it by effectiveness. Fritz Sharp would agree with this. You can't legitimate the EU democratically. All you have to do is to do it technocratically. The centralization of powers in the Commission, Troika, that we heard about this morning, is very much a centralization in the hands of people who, the crat who rules, who makes decisions, is clear. They are not democratically elected or accountable. The key question really is, what is their technic like? The test of the technocrat is not popular election, it's the effectiveness and the logic of what you're doing, because they have been named as agents to sort out the problem. If they don't sort out the problem, then they're failed technocrats. And it's also interesting because in terms of Hans-Peter Kreis's typology, it's state-centered market monetarism rather than neoliberalism in the sense of let the markets decide. It's let the technocrats decide through state-centered intervention, and the EU becoming more of a state than it was when the ECB was launched 11 years ago. That is to say, assuming new powers over budgets, which clearly will be a central function of a national government. Now, as far as the technique, there is the debate about whether austerity will work or whether we should try something that was more Keynesian, and this was presented. Either way, it's interventionist. I think I'm much more concerned with whether it's technically possible. The Commission is being asked to look at what revenue and expenditure will be in X country next year. Now, forecasting errors are inevitable, quite apart from the assumptions you make. And any track record of Ministry of Finance national forecasts will either show that there are random errors, and in any given year you have a wide margin of choice. When I wrote the bankruptcy book, I talked about one-eyed Keynesianism, because you always take there are many incentives to take the more optimistic forecast. Expenditure will be less and revenue will be higher. The key point is that the Commission, or whoever represents it, will be asked to evaluate national governments on the basis of numbers, which cannot be proven or disproven, which are forecasts. And the error margin will be significant, like a couple of percent of GDP. Because if your revenue falls and your expenditure rises, that has a double impact on your deficit. And you'll only know in year 3. Probably you'll know in about the 34th month how accurate your judgment was in month 6 the year before. Because it's a simple thing about the error margins, the preliminary accounts for last year, the final accounts. You can even adjust them 5-10 years down the line. But when you spent as much a decade or so of reading the footnotes and watching these numbers change in retrospect and in prospect, you just think that they lack nobody knows. These are assumptions, and assumptions are variable. They variable, you can say the deficit will be this or that, and you'll know in time which of these, which way it went. The consequences of austerity, I'm suggesting, may be less at the micro level than is feared or anticipated. There will be groups in society that will be badly hit, but a majority of pensioners feel they're better off. Well, no inflation, no house loans, ta-dum. They may sympathize with their grandchildren who can't get jobs. They may vote for a Keynesian package, vote for jobs for the grandchildren. But, the austerity doesn't hit everybody equally. There's a politics of time and consistency. in that we were given win-win and zero-sum this morning. We weren't given lose-lose, whereas the short-term consequences of a number of austerity packages are lose-lose. And the object of lose-lose packages is that we come out with win-win in the long term. Well, the front-end losses are real. I thought the Greek paper was very interesting about emergency clauses. And if you look at the Fifth French Constitution, you've got to recall Parliament and they expire in 6 months. I think the Romans had something too. But the peculiarity of what's being done under emergency clauses is that these are permanent treaties, or maybe you can hand back your shares in a private international organization. But it's the permanency of the emergency. These are not reversible. They're irreversible commitments. And if people are saying we must do this to save the euro, they will certainly be even less inclined to encourage people opting out when the bad news has happened. The justification. In my book on representing Europeans, I point out that explanation is not justification. And I think Bruno's paper was an excellent, a splendid explanation of how it was done. I'm not sure I would like to campaign on that in the national election. It's justified European values solidarity. Well, as we see, the creditor countries don't feel that much solidarity. And feeling closer to other European countries, the Greeks come high. But that shows the ambiguity of we're all in this. And Germans who feel closer to Greeks may also have a bit of things. But solidarity is now a very ambiguous concept. And I think this table shows that you cannot, the radius of solidarity is shrunk or is low or is insufficient to assume lots more commitments to save Europe for the sake of solidarity with 28 countries. And if you look at the countries scheduled for candidates for entry, I think you might find it even less, to pick up Hans-Peter Creasy's concern with cosmopolitanism, because whether there's a social distancing, Germans aren't Greeks, Greeks aren't Germans, but that can have some sort of ethnic polarization or slur in that, whatever you like. But this is a static question. What can we do now? The dynamics are much more interesting because European integration is profoundly ambiguous. It's not clear whether we're talking about where we are now or an ever closer union, whether it's dynamic. And I interpret the European Union's evolution since the phrase was put into the Treaty of Rome as a dynamic process. I agree with Jean Monnet. And Angela Merkel is talking about the dynamics of integration. Now, what we see in these two figures are the median group bloc of Europeans in 2009 was in favor of things as they are. There's a trick or a sleight of hand or an honest confusion to describe people who are in favor of the European Union as it is to want more of it. This suggests that the median person is in favor of it as it is. The argument of my analysis is they will judge any proposals for more integration pragmatically. And if you want to argue we need more integration in order to save German banks, okay. That's a pragmatic argument. It's not an argument for an ever closer union. And if you want to argue for an ever closer union, and the cost is saving German banks or whatever, bailing out banks. It's not the best justification for European Union one might like. Here again, the bottom figure shows that those into spring 2012, the scale of those who are neutral, that is, show us what you want to do, show us the justification, and maybe we'll be for it, or maybe we won't. This is a pragmatic evaluation, which is different from saving the Eurozone, saving the Union. Now, coming back to the last theme in my paper, how do European citizens cope with European elites? If you read the Lisbon Treaty, they believe in representative democracy. And representative democracy means national parliaments can decide what happens, and by extension, European parliaments. The median government at any time has about 49% of the national vote when I calculated it at the time of the 2009 European election. I think some of the people on the panel would say support for the median government that turns up in the European Council meeting is rather less than 49%, unless it's a grand coalition. There are two things we know must happen. The European Parliament election will certainly fuse second and first order. One option for countries that are in trouble is to say the problem is their fault. The Greek survey data I've seen shows that Greeks are realistic. They know it's their own fault. They're proud nationalists. Nobody can screw up like we do. The people in the north didn't understand what was going on. The Italians can say it's a condition. If you think conditionality in the EU works, you should look at how being a founder state in the EU has improved the governance of Repubblica Italiana. The EU is very tolerant. It can have an impact on mainstream parties. We can accept that the problem is our fault and we need European Union help. I think this is the Irish case. I haven't researched it thoroughly, but the point I want to make is Ireland, Portugal, Greece are separate countries to be analyzed separately and don't generalize, and I'm sure Italy and Spain would be the same, or France. If you want to justify electing EP pro-Stability Pact parties, I don't think parties will want to campaign for national votes backing the Stability Pact. They'll want to try and keep things first order. There will be some interference in Britain. UKIP could come first. It will certainly fight Labour for first and put pressure on Labour. In Finland and in Sweden, the anti-EU people will get visibility, but they won't get big votes, I would expect. It's the impact on national parties that counts. But when they come back to European Parliament, the key question is, what does it do to the Black-Red coalition? Will they find a way of insisting that blacks and reds, will have a bigger voice on what is done, will be able to interfere with the technocrats, the European technocrats who are interfering with national parliaments, because that's what multi-level governance is about. And if they have an institutional interest, the EP does, in regaining ground that they have lost, either to the Commission or to something that Bruno was deciding, which is a Commission in a different guise. But whether they could actually agree on a policy, the blacks and the reds. The SPD and the CDU might agree at home, but whether they would agree in Brussels, I'm not so sure, with the Italians and the Spanish. This is a very flaky sort of coalition. The second thing is we will have national elections in which first and second order will be joined. Where will the median voter be? The median voter will be for no change, but the fiscal pact is a rolling series of there will be changes. Will we be like the IMF, which would even look at the Swedish economy? Or will we just look at it? Will the fact that we're looking at a national economy be a sign to the bond markets that there's trouble? We smell trouble. But there are changes. Where will the mainstream parties be? My own view is that the logic of the situation is that what Bruno was describing was what Jean-Claude Paris describes as enhanced cooperation. The fact that it was not done through the treaty makes it more interesting as law. Politically, it means it's a coalition of the willing. And if mainstream parties are prepared not to jump ship, not to be like the British, I think that there are some mainstream parties that if things failed and the pact that they signed up to collapsed, they wouldn't complain. They might even welcome it, but they don't want to be the one to pull the plug. So what we will see, I think, after the national elections is a cartel, whether it's called the Grosse Koalition or what was described in the German politics as unique, or whether it's what Alexandra was describing, which is the opposition free rides, by being awkward, because it isn't going to pull the plug. And it's interesting the way Watch Miliband, as he's going for votes, he's saying the Eurosceptics aren't all wrong, but he doesn't want to create a panic amongst the City of London and other people, saying, well, actually, I'll be for withdrawal or something. So I think we're going to end up with national mainstream parties not mobilizing popular consent. The last point is, how much mileage is there in the can that's being kicked down the road? The can represents treaty avoidance. That's, you can only say how long. You can't never say never in politics. Never say there will never be a requirement for another treaty for any one of a number of reasons. First of all, I wrote this without coordination with Bruno, that the European Stability Mechanism is a joint stock company. So is the IMF. So this is, I wouldn't call, if this were a democratic deficit, it wouldn't bother me so much. But if it's a technocratic deficit as well, front-end loading, lose output, it doesn't make sense to Fritz Sharp as the academic, and it certainly doesn't make sense to Fritz as an enemy of the Bundesbank from way, way back. So I think that there is the justification of following the rules laid out there is not something that's very robust. I quote Article 16, steps shall be taken to normalize this civil partnership, or whatever you want to call it. It's a very odd couple in Article 16 of the Treaty of Stability, Coordination, and Governance. Barroso himself has offered his State of the Union speech, and this is simply making explicit the most pro-European hopes. Don't let a crisis go to waste. We will put forward explicit ideas for a treaty. Now, the difference between a treaty in this context is that you can't call it a Vertrag or Vertuve Kitzinger's policy called the Versailles Treaty a diktat. But a treaty has to go through the normal treaty procedures. And there will be pressures from London, from Karlsruhe, from administrative necessity to how do you bring the Commission in on a normal basis. A treaty would require at least 3 national referendums, and given that 22 countries have held referendums, the interesting thing here is that any treaty document that was put would also have to have opt-out clauses if it were to survive. In other words, if you had 23 or 24, if you could expect 23 to 25 governments that signed up to it to carry 50.1%, you'd still have to have opt-out clauses. And that Paris is offering advice to the British House of Commons Committee on how to do this. It's up to a point. You couldn't do it for Turkish admission, but you'd have, it's a sort of squaring the circle with what Bruno was describing, if you have treaties with enhanced cooperation. So the logic of this is you start out trying to promote an ever closer union with the Eurozone, and you end up with more variable geometry.